Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. I am pleased to welcome you to this discussion about the first 100 days of presidential administration. We have an incredible lineup of guest speakers on this panel, and to all of you, thank you for giving us your time and your talent this evening. My colleagues and I are honored to host you for this really important conversation. My name is Roxanne Adler-Hickey, and I'm the director of the William & Mary Washington Center. The Washington Center is intended to be a small campus in the city for students and alumni alike, a place of belonging for all of us. We offer what we call Study in DC opportunities so that students can spend a week or up to an entire semester living and interning while earning academic credit in DC. Alumni mentors, speakers, and supervisors are the heart of these programs. If you'd like to engage with our students, we'd certainly love to have you. For alumni, we offer programs like our upcoming leadership course and opportunities to network through events at the center. We are also celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, a chance to raise scholarship funds and increase student access to these programs. And among other things, we are happy to present an especially robust event series showcasing our incredible students, faculty, alumni, and campus partners. We are joined for this event by one such partner, the Global Research Institute, led by Director Mike Tierney, a colleague I've known and very much admired for many years. We are a Stronger Washington Center together, and along with our colleagues in University Advancement, are proud to present you with One Tribe. Tonight's event is also an opportunity to highlight William & Mary's new university-wide democracy initiative, a working group on which I am privileged to serve. With a three-pronged approach, William & Mary is charting a more inclusive future for our university and for democracy. First, we will gather experts and resources from across the university to elevate democratic theory and practice. Second, we will engage our community through partnerships and collaboration. And third, we will convene conversations that bolster democratic values and affirm meaningful civil debate. I hope you'll find that tonight's event does all three. In a moment, Mike Tierney will introduce you to Michael Powell, who will moderate our panel, facilitate questions from the audience. And then, as you can see on our agenda, at 7 o'clock, you will also have an opportunity to meet in small groups with the William & Mary faculty as you choose from the topics of international development, diplomacy, or national security. We will post links for you to select your topics when we reach that portion of the evening. And in the meantime, you may feel free to use the Q&A feature to submit questions. And we do intend to be able to respond to at least some of them after the initial panel discussion. So at this time, I thank you again, all of you, for being here, and I will go ahead and turn things over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Roxanne. I appreciate that. It's great to be here tonight. Very happy to co-host this conversation. GRI is a multidisciplinary research hub that supports 10 student faculty research labs that conduct research on pressing global challenges. In addition to supporting these labs, we make investments in student ideas, and we connect our researchers to partners that are in the policy world. We're very lucky tonight to have 4 of those partners with us. All of them have served in different roles in the policy world. 2 of them have guest lectured in courses taught by GRI faculty here at William & Mary or in the DC Center. 2 of them have also served as discussants for the Project on International Peace and Security, our undergraduate research lab here at GRI. And 1 served as a judge for the Shark Tank competition in the before times. Like many in our audience tonight, 3 of them have done a considerable amount of hard time in the basement of Morton Hall. And we're grateful to have all of them with us tonight sharing their insights. If you'd like to learn more about GRI or becoming a partner of GRI, please feel free to look in the chat for the link to our homepage or to just contact me via email. Now I'd like to turn things over to our moderator. Michael Powell is president of the National Cable and Telecommunications Association. He previously served as chairman of the FCC, as an attorney in the Justice Department, as an officer in the US Army, and closer to home here, he served as the rector for William & Mary's Board of Visitors. 2 years ago, Michael served as a judge in GRI's Student Research Shark Tank competition. He asked great questions of the students, and I'm sure he'll do the same tonight with our distinguished panelists. Michael, thanks for doing this. The Zoom room is yours.
Thank you, Professor Tierney, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I'd invite our panelists to turn their cameras on so we can introduce them to the group for this really interesting conversation about a president's first 100 days. And to have that conversation, we're joined by first Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, who proudly represents Florida's Congressional 7th District and is a proud member of the William & Mary Class of 2000. Welcome, Congresswoman. It's great to have you. We have Mitchell Reese, known to many of us as the former president and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Before that, he had a very long and illustrious career in foreign service. He's an expert on Asia and was instrumental in issues related to Northern Ireland. And we're also joined by Liz Schreier, the president and CEO of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, a broad-based coalition of 500 businesses and NGOs that advocate U.S. global leadership through development and diplomacy. Welcome to all of you. So let's get started. We talk about the first 100 days. It's worth sort of remembering, well, where did this come from? The term was first coined in a radio address by FDR as he was entering the 5th month of his presidency in the midst of one of the greatest crises facing the United States in the Great Depression. And he had made a pledge upon taking office that he would urgently address the problems facing the country. By today's standards, it was breathtaking. He passed, I believe, close to 76 laws and 99 executive orders in that first 100 days. I would note, if you look at every president since, nobody's come even remotely close to meeting his record. And there's been a slow, steady decline in the amount of achievements in that first 100 days. So in some ways, the first question is it still important? Is it still a critical period for any new modern president to achieve a great deal in that first 100 days, and how do you think about it? Congresswoman, could I ask your thoughts about that first?
Sure. Let me just first say how excited I am to be on this distinguished panel with folks that I have had an opportunity to engage with over my career, and starting first with Mitchell Reese, who was the scholar in residence when I was doing my work study at the International Affairs Center at William & Mary. And he's just had an incredible career, and I admire him so much. And Michael, I don't know if you remember, but we've met through your time at NCTA and have just been really grateful to be able to work with you and your members. And then Liz, when I first ran for Congress, your organization thoroughly vetted me. And I felt like my William & Mary education, as well as my boards at Georgetown, prepared me for the grilling that I received from the organization as a candidate in the 2016 congressional race. So it is just a great joy to be here with you all. And of course, with Professor Tierney, who produces incredible research that actually has a pragmatic and practical implication, because I know my staff consumes it and it helps to inform the work that we do. So just super excited to be here and for our common connection. But to answer your question, Michael, about, this first 100 days, it is almost a self-imposed 100 days, but it is also an opportunity to establish the kind of administration you might be. There are some challenges to people's ability to be effective in the first 100 days. And I think this administration has had quite a few of those challenges insofar as the transition wasn't your normal administration to administration transition. And I'd love to hear what Mitchell has to say about that, having been a part of the transitions. But just as an outside perspective, we know that the transition wasn't as smooth as one would have hoped. I mean, I remember the transition between the Clinton Bush years, the most detrimental thing they did was to pop the W off of the keyboards in the White House. That seems like child's play compared to some of the things that left this administration a little less prepared. The other thing in that first 100 days is how fast can you get your A team confirmed and in place. And so that's taken some time a little bit because it took this particular Senate a little bit longer to organize because it wasn't clear who exactly was in power, given a 50-50 with the VP as the tiebreaker. And so that took a little bit longer for them to organize and start the process of confirming the Biden administration folks. But, you know, despite some of the challenges of the transition, I think in the first 100 days, if you look at what the Biden administration said that they would do, 100 million shots in the first 100 days, they well outpaced that goal. I think it was 60 some odd days. And now you're seeing vaccines fairly widely distributed in communities and the end in sight as far as the pandemic is concerned. They were able to pass within the first 100 days a massive relief package that included shots in arms and checks in pockets for the American people who are still dealing with the pandemic and the economic crisis that ensued. And that has significant consequences for what the rest of this term will look like as our economy looks to recover from this. And then they have been able to have pretty much, with the exception of one, I think just one or two of their appointments, get the Senate approval that they need to get in place and to get moving. And then on the foreign policy front, there are a lot of positions that need to be filled. And there are a number of challenges that you just can't predict that will happen in your first 100 days, like the border crisis or what North Korea normally does, which is to launch rockets and challenge us. Those are things that are happening because our adversaries understand that we are in this first 100 days and this administration is trying to set the tone for their administration.
Yeah.
But I think on the whole, they're doing good.
Yeah. So I want to turn a little bit later to some of the specifics of the Biden initial period, but let's stick for a second with why the urgency? Why is it important? Is it important for the president to act decisively, if not the first 100 days, in the front end of their presidency? Mitchell, you've certainly served in different administrations. What is it about that first couple of months that's so essential to get moving?
Well, you know the old saying, you only have one chance to make a first impression.
Mm-hmm.
And so the administration right out of the gate wants to set the tone. And the congressman checked actually a number of the boxes that the administration has done well on. They've gotten most of their personnel, at least their cabinet level, confirmed. They've only had one little hiccup and they moved on from it. They're moving out aggressively with their legislative agenda. They have given a series of speeches on foreign policy with Secretary Blinken in Asia and in Europe that was sandwiched around a rather adversarial meeting with the Chinese that has made it very clear what the direction of the Biden administration's foreign and defense policy is going to be. And I think that's really smart and very, very important. And then the final box to check is every administration needs a bit of good luck. And you don't want a foreign crisis in the first 100 days because, as the Congresswoman said, you're not really fully staffed up for this yet. And aside from the border crisis, which was, I would argue, partly self-inflicted, I think the administration so far, their luck's holding. I don't think what the North Koreans are doing is terribly surprising. And I think that a rather even-keeled approach to their provocations and strong coordination with our allies is the best way forward. And the Biden team seems to be doing exactly that.
Yeah. Liz, it's interesting. Obviously, those first few months are essential to the administration internally, essential to their supporters, essential to their vision and their agenda. For people who are working outside the administration with a decided interest in the outcome of policy, do you see the first 100 days with equal significance as the administration does, or is it kind of just a marketing gesture that allows us all to get to work and there's really nothing that important about that first 100 days? How do you see
That's a
it?
great question. Well, first, I have to just say I'm so honored to be part of this group because I'm the odd person out. I'm not a William and Mary alum, and so I'm honored to be with such an extraordinary group of panel. But I am pretty excited because my alma mater is in the Elite Eight later tonight, so go Blue. Had to get that in. But you're all extraordinary, and Congresswoman, you've been remarkable in your leadership in Congress. So I hope we didn't put you through too much of a ringer. So I'm not sure. I got to talk to my colleagues and Ambassador and Michael. You're amazing. You know, I think about kind of that you know, even the Elite Eight as an example. This 100-day question, Michael, is such a great question because we have the shortest attention span. And so, you know, Roosevelt was brilliant in kind of marking this period of time with this audacity and this ambition to frame this 100-day to say, judge me. You know, can I get something done? And boy, did he get something done. And here President Biden goes out and says, I'm going to get 100 million shots in arms. And obviously he blew past that. But I think the key is what the Congresswoman and Mitchell have already said. There are things that a president can control, and especially when we're talking foreign policy, and then there's things that the president can't control. So he can control how many shots you can get in the arms. But think about today. Today is the anniversary day of Ronald Reagan's attempted assassination. It was on his 70th day. That impacted his first 100 days. Let's think about this. 9/11 did not happen for President Bush, obviously in his first 100 days, but it impacted his whole presidency. And if it had happened in his first 100 days, it would have, you know, impacted it that much earlier. Raj Shah, who was President Obama's USAID administrator, on day 6 of his USAID administrator, Haiti earthquake happened. It impacted his whole experience as USAID administrator. So there's some things you can control. I agree with Ambassador, Mitchell. When you were talking about personnel, he's done pretty good getting it through. But he goes out on a victory lap on the American Rescue Plan to Georgia and his press conference. And what does the press want to talk about? They want to talk about the tragedy of the gun violence and about the border crisis. So you can't control it all. So Michael, to your question, the outside world, of course, wants to impact that 100 days. It's a great marketing tool, and it's exactly what they want to do. So the last thing I would say is, here's an example of what people want to do. Every 4 years, I noticed, this goes back to 2008, I literally noticed that every think tank in America, in Washington, does a report. And in 2008, they were literally piling up on my desk and I could not read. And I thought, how in the world are my friends going into the administration, Democrat or Republican, going to read it? So we started doing something called the Report on Reports. And so we do it every 4 years. We read 120, I didn't, my colleagues did, 120 reports called the Report on Reports. And we found the consensus areas of what everybody agrees on foreign policy and national security through the lens of development and diplomacy. And I hosted Jake Sullivan, the new national security advisor, to say, guess what? Here's what from political stripes, here's what they agree on. So Michael, to your point, they were largely saying, here's what you, new administration, they were all written before the election, so they didn't know who would win, what they think you should do in the first 100 days. So yes, everybody's trying to use that first 100 days to advance their interests. And we can talk about what they actually said.
Yeah, so it seems like we're in violent agreement that the early innings of a presidency are pretty essential. It seems to me, sum up some of these comments, that often the president's highest ratings are in this period, probably they're often their high point of popularity. Very often, if you look back at the data, one or both chambers are in the control of the same party, typically. You have a little more influence with Congress as a result. You have a fresh and eager cabinet and team ready to get to work. And you know, the unsung risk that you haven't started the infighting and the leaking yet that sometimes undoes an administration. But you know, in recent years, it does seem that there's another reason that creates this kind of urgency, which is our election seasons have been badly drawn out. It's starting to feel as if the presidency is only the first year, and then we're in election mode. And I wonder, Congressman, if you'd say something about that. It seems that in many ways, campaigning has superseded governing, and you basically get a year to govern and then game on for 2022 and beyond. Do you feel that frustration?
I'm in the lower chamber, and so I get elected every 2 years. And I would tell you that I think it's too much. I would go with the British model of like you get a limited amount of time, a few months out from the election, and a limited amount of money, and then that be that. And the rest of that time that you're serving in elected office is dedicated to doing your job. The pressures are enormous. The campaign starts almost as soon as you complete your last election, particularly in seats like mine that are purple and red that determine the majority. There's enormous pressure. And so what ends up happening is that you have members who work 3 jobs. I have my day job of all of the policy and legislative work, which I'm really proud of. I've been named one of the most effective members as well as one of the most bipartisan, because that's how I deliver for my constituents. But I also have like a lot of other hours that I have to dedicate to the constant campaigning. And I think that that's why it's so important that we have campaign finance reform, that we get dark money out of politics, that we return and I know that the courts have determined that campaign dollars are speech, but really it should be speech among the people, not speech among the powerful. And unfortunately, our system right now interprets power and people to be the same thing. And so it puts a lot of pressure. And so what I am seeing as we try to get big things done in the midst of a pandemic and an economic recession is that politics, particularly on my colleagues on the other side, is overriding some of the policy that would be good for their constituents. So I'll give you a really good example. In the last couple of weeks when we were in Washington, we voted on a number of things that, your audience might say, well, that seems simple. Violence Against Women Act. Maybe women should be protected against having domestic abuse or other kinds of abuse. Or Equal Rights Act. Women should be paid the same amount as men. I mean, we are in the 21st century. These are things that are broadly popular. Or universal background checks. Even that among people who are NRA card-carrying NRA members, there's broad support for that. And we lost votes compared to last cycle because this cycle is more competitive. The 22 election is more competitive, and Republicans are very close to being able to win back the House. And so that is causing people to vote their politics as opposed to the policy that the people want. And I think that's a real shame, because we had a chance to take a vote on some of these issues and make real change in this country. And yet the electeds are voting their personal politics instead of the people's will.
That's really true. And, it leads me to think about, and Liz, I might ask you if you have the same reflection. When you look back on FDR, it seemed like real policy addressing real problems. It feels increasingly like so much of what happens is the effort to undo the policies of a prior administration, that we're in this kind of cycle where stuff gets done and undone. And that's sort of the game, as opposed to sort of affirmatively, taking on new challenges or the challenges that are really facing the country. Have you sensed that, Liz? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's one of the big mistakes, is throw out the other guy's idea just because it's the other guy's or gal's idea. The good news, I would say, is this, Michael. The work that I live in foreign policy, and particularly in the space of how we use our civilian tools, development and diplomacy, with which Congresswoman Murphy and Ambassador Reese have been key players on, has been one of the rare places where there is bipartisan agreement. And so an example of that is when Mark Green came in as the USAID administrator at the beginning of the Trump administration. He looked and said, you know what? Feed the Future, a program that President Obama started to deal with food insecurity, is actually really good. I'm not going to throw it out just because it had the other guy's name on it. I might tweak it. I might do something a little different. I'm not going to throw it out. Samantha Power, who is the nominee for President Biden, has said, I'm not going to throw out Mark Green's journey for self-reliance, his reform efforts at USAID. I'm actually going to build on it. So we've seen in the last decade 50 bipartisan bills that have been supported by Freedom Caucus members and Progressive Caucus members together, working together in this space. So I think it happens way too often, but interestingly enough, this is one space when it comes to America's role in the world where I think there actually is a lot to build on. And I'm hoping we're going to see it now. We're going to find out, and I can talk about it, where we're going to see the skinny budget come out in just 2 days for the Biden administration. And we're going to see on foreign policy what his position is going to be on restoring America's role in the world, and whether the Republicans are just going to beat it up because the other guy, or they actually will stick to this vision of America.
Yeah, and I can tell you, representing industry groups whose real bias is only for certainty and finality, that there's nothing more maddening than, right or wrong, let's settle something and let it stay settled for some period of time so we can really make plans and make investment, make choices based on the law, as opposed to wondering whether the law will ever settle. It's a really, I can tell you from CEOs, it's a deepening frustration with, one way or the other, let's have something be over so we can plan on it. Mitchell, I'd love for you to share with us a little bit, if you're the president of another nation, or the legislature of an ally, or even potentially a foe, what do the early months of it, what are you looking for in the early months of an administration? That is, how do foreign constituencies sort of digest this first 100 days? It's often sort of presented very domestically. I'm just kind of curious, what's Putin doing in this first 3 months?
Well, God knows what Putin's doing. So let's choose another example.
Your other favorite.
Yeah. I think if I'm the leader of a foreign country, I need to have already had my diplomatic team reach out to the new administration a year ago. Okay. If now you're waiting to queue up in line to get a meeting with the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, even the Assistant Secretary of State, you're going to be out of luck. You need to have established relationships with these people. They're mostly Washington professionals, they're very experienced, so they've been around a long time. You should have pre-existing relationships, your team should, with all these folks. And then there's something that we don't like to admit. You can always hire a lobbying firm in order to advance your cause in Washington, D.C. And it gets back to the money that the Congresswoman was talking about. But often that happens also. And if you want a little bit of extra firepower to your diplomatic effort. So the best way to do it is really on personal relationships. The Biden team has been around for a long time. I don't think any of them are going to be strangers to the diplomatic corps. So they should have been working this issue for many months now, and there shouldn't be any surprises for a foreign leader.
So Mitchell, let me ask you, maybe Stephanie, you have a thought on this too, given some of the committees you sit on. Is the nation rightfully on a higher defense posture in the beginning of a new administration? Is there potential national security risks in the early innings of administration that are unique?
I think some of our adversaries will take advantage of the setting up of shop to kind of test us and see how we respond. I think that the Biden administration, with their strategic strike in Syria, demonstrated that they are ready to enact foreign policy and national security early in their administration, and they're not to be messed with. And so I think that was a good kind of marker to put out there. I think the conversation we're having with the Chinese, arguably one of our most challenging competitors, shows that this administration has a very strong backbone as it relates to the violations of international law that China has continued to to do, and that we are not going to be easily pushed over just because it's a new administration, that much of our policy will remain the same. The new USTR just said that I'm not giving up leverage and lifting the tariffs without some sort of concession. A good negotiator doesn't give up leverage. And so you're seeing a tough foreign policy posture from a good part of the Biden administration on some of our key challenges.
Just while we're on this topic, we're really in a very different world than when I first joined, in which, some of these threats are cybersecurity. We had the attack on SolarWinds, and this stuff barely sort of makes the news for a day, but then goes underground, but it's almost as serious as any other conceivable attack. It would seem that the world of weapons and tanks and armor, while still there, the threats are different. And I wonder whether, Liz and Mitchell, the importance of soft power or the importance of development, the importance of engaging in the world with other tools. Would each of you say something about that?
Sure. Liz is the expert on development, so let me try and talk a little bit about soft power. Our soft power is unprecedented, but it doesn't always benefit us. Some of our music, some of our films, they are found offensive by other audiences around the world. So our soft power, which is not directed by the government, but simply it's part of who we are as a country, is a mixed blessing. Our freedom to express ourselves clearly is, I think, the ultimate expression of soft power. But I wrote an article last year at the Wilson Center about soft power diplomacy in the 40s, 50s, and 60s by administrations that would send prominent African Americans overseas to talk about racial progress in the United States. And the most prominent among them were what were called the jazz ambassadors. This is Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, to try to showcase how brilliant America is and how wonderful it is and how it's getting better for African Americans. And the data showed that people loved the concerts, they loved the music, they loved the entertainers, but it didn't really move the needle in how they perceived race relations in the United States. That only changed with the Civil Rights Acts and the Voting Rights Act in the mid-60s. And so I think the lesson there is, yes, our soft power is an undeniable asset, but people are looking for us to make progress on a number of issues that the Congresswoman identified at the top of the show. And it's going to be that substantive progress that really is going to create the perception, the impression, the image of the United States as the country that we all want it to be. So soft power is important, but the substance really matters. That's what's going to endure.
What I would add is this. When I mentioned earlier that I hosted Jake Sullivan for our launch of this report and reports, the foreign policy of this administration is about a foreign policy grounded in our middle class. Everything that USGLC, my organization, talks about is our foreign policy that is about leading globally matters locally, that it is about what matters to the American family. Nothing said that clearer than the global pandemic we're in. It is the ultimate reminder that what happens overseas matters and connects locally. That when you have 235 million people that are expected to need humanitarian support this year, 40% increase from last year around the world, it is going to have a dramatic impact on our health and economic and security recovery. So we just finished a needs assessment of what happens globally. How does that impact what we should be connecting in terms of international resources overseas to connect to our health and economic resources? Pandemic prevention, global and health, like how does famine impact us? When more and more people, there's going to be a doubling of how many people are potentially going to be in starvation. Every time that doubles, that affects our national security, that affects climate migration. It affects our national security, and there is an uptick in Boko Haram in Africa, and I could go on and on. Time I won't. So that is the second one. Bolstering our competition. The Congressman talked about China, bolstering our economic competition with China. So we did a needs assessment of what would it take for us to invest. And we came up with an additional, with lots of experts on all different political spectrum, of $14 billion additional resources in the international affairs budget. Think about, we just spent $5 trillion to respond to our economic domestic needs over the last year. Imagine if we spent 14 billion extra dollars globally to invest in pandemic prevention. That's the kind of thing we're talking about to protect our American families. That's the kind of thing we're talking about when it comes to development and diplomacy, or what you call soft power.
Yeah, that's terrific. Let me invite Professor Tierney back into the conversation to see if we have some questions from the audience. Mike, do we have some questions from the audience we can present to the panelists?
We do. I'll tell you three, and you can divvy them out as you see fit, or let the panelists arm wrestle. So Max Berkmuller, who's a student in my Introduction to International Politics class, he wants to know about what are the most important issues that the Biden administration will face over the course of its first year. But I'd just like to add, after you do important, think about most likely to make progress on, to see if those are the same two things. Then William Ross asks, he wants to follow up on the quote about, let's just undo what the prior administration did. Earlier, Congresswoman Murphy mentioned the statement that the US government made after the diplomatic meeting in Alaska. Would be interested to know if other members of the panel thought that set the right tone, or if that was a diplomatic error on the part of Biden. And the last question is from the more historically oriented. They want to know, other than FDR, what is the best example of ideal political transition in the first 100 days?
Okay, that was a lot, but we'll do our best. Let's ask the Congresswoman to take on the first, which is Biden's first year. What are the most important pieces of legislation, and some handicapping of their probability of becoming law?
Great, thanks. And the questions are a lot because it's William and Mary's students. And so I'm very proud of them for throwing out tough, hard balls here. First, I think there is what the administration wanted to come into this term addressing, and then there are things that are out of their control that they must address. So on the things that they wanted to address, they said very clearly that they want us to crush this virus and to create an economic recovery that is equitable for all Americans. And I think we are well on our way in that effort with the vaccinations getting out there, with additional resources to support working families and small businesses, and then a potential on the horizon package that will make, if you think about what we've done over the last year and year or so as immediate relief efforts, the next 6 months, maybe a year, depending how long it takes us to get the bill out, will be recovery. And then that will be about making real investments into the American economy and primarily our infrastructure, both physical infrastructure as well as human capital infrastructure. And that is coming together. I think we will achieve something, whether it is exactly as the administration envisioned and is going to unroll this week, or it's something that is negotiated among Democrats and Republicans and can sustain the votes, that it's as bold as the votes will bear, is to be determined. What I will also say about that, though, is that, to touch on that bipartisan piece, I think that legislation that is bipartisan is more durable. Whether you're talking about healthcare or taxes or infrastructure, If you have a solely partisan vote, the only certainty you introduce into the American economy and the markets is uncertainty, because the next time the political pendulum swings, you can be certain that the other party will try to unwind because they didn't have any buy-in to that process. So my hope is that we move forward in a way that has the broadest buy-in possible and the broadest benefit possible for the American people and for the political representatives who represent them. And on the stuff that is unpredicted, obviously the border. I don't know that the administration realized that this would be a crisis that they would have to deal with, but it is certainly the crisis that they have to deal with before we can even begin to talk about comprehensive immigration reform. And the Democratic Party is the party to talk about comprehensive immigration reform that allows us to live into our American values and support our economic growth and do so in a way that is humane. But we can't begin to have those conversations with our partners on the other side of the aisle or in the other chamber until we secure the border. And so that is probably an issue that they didn't expect to have to deal with, but they're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mitchell, the question about the meeting in Alaska and whether the administration stumbled or not in setting the tone. What was your reaction to it?
Well, first of all, I think that their Chinese counterparts set the tone at the beginning of that meeting with a rant from one of their leaders. But I was very happy the way that the Secretary of State responded to it. And I think it's extremely important because there's been nothing short of a sea change in Washington over the last few years in terms of attitudes towards China, where there was much hope that it would be, in the words of Bob Zoellick, a responsible stakeholder. I think now people see it as a much more complex type of relationship where we can cooperate in a few areas, but we're going to be adversaries. Hopefully not descending into conflict, but certainly adversaries on a whole host of other issues. And the Biden administration's officials had a history under President Obama of being, rightly or wrongly, I think, overly conciliatory towards the Chinese. And so I think that they understood that. And I think they realized that they had to make a statement. They had to set a clear path forward. And I thought that they did extremely well. But again, that meeting took place after meetings with our allies in Asia, in South Korea and Japan. And then right after that meeting with the Chinese, the Secretary flew to Europe, had meetings with leaders there, including at NATO. And so again, I think it's the totality of their diplomatic approach right now is one that privileges allies and friends and is going to really confront China when it's necessary and cooperate when it's possible.
It's interesting. I think the third question was along the lines of, historically, what's another example of an excellent transition other than FDR. I will tell you from the chart I saw that the second most bills passed by a president were Truman, shortly following. Anyone have anything else to add of one that they thought was particularly exemplary?
Well, Michael, can I just offer a contrarian approach that FDR was so extraordinary because the country was in such dire shape. Over 4,000 banks had failed when he became president, and 25% of the workforce was unemployed. So the man and the moment came together, and maybe we should just be grateful that we haven't had to have such an exercise in presidential leadership since then, because we haven't had that type of crisis since then. So that's just simply another way of looking at it.
Yeah.
I would add one other perspective, though. It's a little outside the scope of the 100 days, but it is about presidential leadership. And there's surprises that come along the way. And one surprise on the foreign policy, I'll give you two things to think about on the surprise on foreign policy. I teach for Madeleine Albright in her class at Georgetown every semester about how foreign assistance is used as a national security toolkit. And I remind them that George Bush, when he ran, that Mitchell worked for, ran as a candidate to end nation building. He was kind of, the anti-Clinton on that. And then what does he do? He does the biggest, most important, significant to this day, foreign aid investment that was, as Congressman Murphy said, bipartisan, bicameral, brought in Democrats and Republicans, and still to this day, and that is PEPFAR, our effort to fight HIV/AIDS. And so watch for presidential leadership when they reach out and really do big ideas and big things that matter to the American public. And the second thing I would say is something both of you, the panelists, other panelists talked about. Admiral James Stavridis often talks about a dial. And he talks about the dial, and he does it in the context of hard power, soft power, that we have to know when and how to use dials. And I think what Biden is looking like he's trying to do on foreign policy is that he's learning from the Obama experience, that you need to find the right dial. And immigration may be one of those. George Bush is trying to give him a lift on this, is to find that right dial to listen to where the country is. And in Northern Triangle, it is focusing on that root, the root causes. And he is sending Vice President Harris, obviously, to do what Obama did, is sending then Vice President Biden down to focus on root causes. That's why, parents put their children in danger to go up to the border, and finding that dial. And I think those are two things we should watch: big ideas and finding the dial of where the hearts are of the American public.
Yeah, Liz, can I stick with you for a second? Because we have a question that might be in your bailiwick here. What's the biggest innovation in foreign aid and development finance? Can the US compete with China's BRI, or should we even try? Do they have new and innovative ideas, or are we going back to the Obama playbook?
It's interesting. I did an hour session earlier today with Senator Mitt Romney in Utah. We had I'm told about 60,000 people that joined in online. And the whole hour was about China and competing against them. And the big idea, one of the big ideas, which isn't big enough, because we're never going to, their Belt Road Initiative, they're spending $1 trillion, largely in the developing world, that we will never beat dollar for dollar. And we don't need to, but we need to compete. And one of the ways that we're competing is a big innovation that is very bipartisan. And it was started by a piece of legislation called the BUILD Act that was to up our game in development finance. And so we recreated an agency that was once called OPIC. It's now called the Development Finance Corporation. I am on the board advisory committee, and it is a very important part of the toolkit. It's not the only toolkit: USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation, many other pieces of the puzzle. But I think it's an important one that we go in and invest and use our development finance insurance risk toolkit when the private sector isn't going to invest there. So we could spend literally an hour just talking about this, but I think we have to be innovative of how we go in with government. If we had met here, 50 years ago and done this panel, 80% of the capital flow going into the developing world would have been government money. Today, it's 10%. Government money is a small player in it, which is fine. Michael, Mike Turney, Professor Turney, you're the best in the business of following the data. So the key question is, how do you use that small shareholder piece of U.S. government to leverage that no one else is going to do? Get at the corruption, get at infrastructure, get at economic and land rights, get at key things that no one else will do, and then get out of the way so private sector can really bring it to scale. And that's the real win. That's how we can compete with China in the developing world, and once we do, America's going to do just great.
It may not be the Great Depression, but the pandemic is certainly a great existential threat that the president has had to step into. So it does have this moment of enormous significance. And in the prior administration, there was a lot of focus on America first. But what we're watching around the world as China sort of engages in mass diplomacy and vaccine diplomacy, that they're really taking advantage of the opportunity to use this crisis to build hearts across the world. Congresswoman, do you think this is something the Biden administration needs to step up on as well? That yes, we got to get all of ourselves back to restaurants, bars, and weddings, but the long-term consequences of not being seen as a leader around the world in the world's greatest healthcare crisis in this century. What do you think about that?
Well, I gave a speech to the USGLC, Liz's organization, where I basically said that I think Democrats probably underestimate the importance of hard power to deter adversaries, while Republicans underestimate the power of soft power. And I think what you're talking about of vaccine diplomacy and countering the Belt and Road Initiative, all those things require, and countering China more broadly, requires a good combination of both. And unfortunately, I think there's a strain of populism that is running through both parties right now, Democrats and Republicans, that is overlearning the lessons from the pandemic, wherein they are suggesting that our solution to securing our supply chain is to domesticate it. And I believe that in order to truly secure our supply chain, you have to have an equal combination of domestication and diversification. And that diversification has to go through our allies. And we have not been great friends in the last few years as it relates to trade. And so there's a lot of ground to make up in order to build the kind of supply chains that enable us to secure our own domestic sources for products to counter national security threats like pandemics. But there's a lot more that we have to do on a proactive basis. And it's one of the reasons why I have a bill on file to look at China's role in Latin America and the Caribbean, where they are trying to increase their presence and power through both soft and hard power. And we need to look at what we are doing through loans and FDI and our military to military relations there, and to respond in a smart and effective way. We need our own plan of action all across this world, not just be reactive to what the Chinese are doing. And that takes a bit of collaboration between the government and our private sector, and also making sure that we don't implement well-intentioned legislation that drives our private sector to domesticate as opposed to diversify. You can do both, and as you can with hard power and soft power.
Yeah. As we look back on this idea of the 100 days, I think FDR is credited also for using the crisis to create a sense of unity and national purpose. And on Inauguration Day, President Biden elected to strike a similar theme about the importance of unifying. We're a terribly divided country. We're dealing with serious social challenge and unrest, everything from the continued awakening of Black Lives Matter movement to the pandemic to economic inequality. He struck the tone, and I think at some level, a president is also our spiritual leader. Are you all, question for everyone as the last question, 100 days or otherwise, do you have a sense of optimism about our ability to harness these challenges to bring greater amount of national unity to our public space? Who wants to go first? Eeny, meeny, miny, Mitch.
I think to be an American is to be optimistic. We are the most resilient country on the planet. We're the most optimistic, we're the most positive, the most entrepreneurial. We're clearly going through a bad patch right now. And I don't think that we're going to get out of it anytime soon. I think we just have to work our way through it and keep on keeping on. I do think that the president is remarkable in him striking the right tone. That really impressed me actually during the transition, where he wasn't distracted from all the other noise that was happening. So I do think that in terms of declaratory policy, I think he's doing an excellent job. I think he needs to continue doing it. I think he needs some help from the other side of the aisle, which would be very welcome, I think, by most Americans. But long term, I'm always optimistic about the United States.
Liz, similar?
I'm going to give you 2 points of reference that make me optimistic, and that's just who I am. You can't live in Washington and do this work if you're not. But one is, as I said earlier, on foreign policy, we tend to be, with the exception of a few pretty rough issues, we tend to be pretty bipartisan, at least in our view of the world and our view. There are some outlying issues, there's no question, but we tend to be. But the second is, it's largely the people on this Zoom call. The young people in this country are engaged and need to be engaged. And that is the most important reason why I get up and I do what I do every single day. They march when it comes to climate change, and I think that is, essential. That is such an essential part of our future. And they engage on issues, whether I personally may agree, or all of us on this call may agree or not. It is your voice that is going to make a difference, and I think that is what makes us optimistic.
Congressman, last word for you.
Sure. I think as somebody whose family escaped persecution and communism and oppression and the lack of opportunity, who chose to get on a boat to sea with small children rather than to live on in that kind of tyranny, whose parents decided that it was better maybe for all of us to die in search of light than to live on in darkness. I am somebody who, having been saved by the US Navy and given an opportunity to live the American dream and go to college at the great College of William and Mary and change the course of my life, I have nothing but optimism about this country. And I believe that our brighter days are ahead of us. We are having a moment, as we do, as democratic nations do. We have moments where we stutter step. But I know that the heart of the American people and the values of this country that are just woven into our institutions and who we are as Americans will prevail. And so I am extremely optimistic, despite the fact that I work in Washington and in Congress, which might seem like a surprise or a contradiction to you all on this call. And I would also like to associate myself to what Liz said. To the students who are on this call who are listening, I was in your shoes at some point in my life, not knowing what laid ahead for me, but knowing I wanted to give back to this country as a part of a long legacy of being a student of the great College of William and Mary. And I found my path in and out of government and in the private sector, much like the esteemed panel that we have. They have served in a lot of different ways. And I hope you will find the rewarding experience that comes with public service, and that you will find your place in making this country a better place. So thank you all so much for having me on.
Well, thank you. I can only say that, the first early months of a presidency really always feel like a crossroads. It's a moment of great opportunity and promise, a chance to turn the page on the long American story, and a chance to recommit ourselves to hope in a better world. And obviously, I want to thank the three panelists who are doing their part to bring that better world into being. So thank you so much for being with you. It's been an honor to be part of this panel. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Roxanne and Mike for the next segment of this evening. Thank you for having us.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Michael. Oh my goodness. And thank you, Congresswoman Murphy, for those really inspirational closing words. You're absolutely right. And that's a message I think that's really great for our students to hear, but for some of us who've been out of school a little longer, it still feels really nice to hear those words. So thank you for that. And Mitchell, Liz, and Michael, to all of you here tonight, thank you for this truly rich discussion. I know that I can speak on behalf of our entire audience when I say how much we appreciate your insights and this conversation. We're so lucky at William & Mary to be able to engage in discussions and conversations and discourse like this, and really grateful to all of you for making tonight happen. Thank you. The second portion of our evening is an opportunity for all of you to engage in some of that conversation rather than just listening to it. So my colleague Elizabeth Merrifield, who is the brains behind all of the logistics tonight, thank you, Elizabeth, for all you've done this evening, has just put up a slide so you can see the 3 opportunities to go and have one of these conversations. So you will actually be leaving this webinar to go visit 3 potential Zoom conversations: international development, national security, and diplomacy. And you have about a half an hour in those rooms. Elizabeth has graciously agreed to stay on for a few minutes for anyone who might be struggling. The links are in the chat now, as well as on your screen. And I also understand that in your confirmation email, you would have received these links as well. So you may feel free at this time to sign off of our webinar and go enjoy some time with our faculty in a smaller discussion. But thank you all again for your time here. We're incredibly grateful. Have a great night.